I'm in Richmond, Virginia, a city absolutely loaded with history. And behind me stands historic St. John's Church, which you may have heard of due to the events that took place here on March 23rd, 1775. It was on that day when Patrick Henry gave his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech in front of men such as Richard Henry Lee, Thomas Jefferson, and even George Washington. And that was an important speech because it convinced Virginia to support a militia and ultimately support the conflict that would become the American Revolution. But beyond Patrick Henry's speech, in this burial ground lies a signer of the Declaration of Independence, George Wythe. It is a beautiful day at historic St. John's, and what's interesting is 5 years ago I actually tried to visit this church and the grave of George Wythe, but unfortunately it was closed and we were just passing through the area. So I'm really excited to be here on a great day to see the church a little bit, but really to visit the final resting place of George Wythe. Well, George Wythe was born into a wealthy family here in Virginia and became one of the most prominent lawyers in the colony. He served as a member of the House of Burgesses, spoke out against the Stamp Act of 1765, and also served in the Continental Congress. Of course, he signed the Declaration of Independence and later attended the Constitutional Convention, though he left before it ended to tend to his dying wife. He also attended the Virginia Ratifying Convention and passionately argued in favor of the U.S. Constitution. But perhaps Wythe's greatest legacy was the students he mentored. Among them was Thomas Jefferson, who later wrote that no man had ever been a greater influence on his education and character. Through Jefferson, Wythe's ideas helped shape the principles of the United States itself. He was also a mentor to men such as John Marshall and Henry Clay. So even though many may have never heard of him, his legacy helped guide the young republic during its earliest years. Wythe was also a slave owner throughout most of his life, but in his later years he openly opposed slavery. And in the years after the Revolutionary War, he began to free the men and women he enslaved, and by his death in 1806, he did not own any slaves. Perhaps the wildest part of his life came at the end. Wythe died on June 8, 1806, after being poisoned. The primary suspect was his grandnephew, George Wythe Sweeney, who was accused of stealing from Wythe and feared being cut out of his inheritance. Sweeney allegedly poisoned coffee with arsenic intended for Wythe. The poisoning also killed Michael Brown. He was a free black teenager who was living in Wythe's household. And although Wythe identified Sweeney as the culprit before he died, Sweeney was ultimately acquitted of murder because black witnesses were not allowed to testify against a white defendant under Virginia law at the time. Wythe died on June 8, 1806, making his death one of the most infamous murder cases involving an American founding father. And here is the final resting place of Virginia signer of the Declaration of Independence, George Wythe. And it's right here next to the church. It's not a very big burial ground. And as you can see, it's a very large stone with this tablet on the front that says it was dedicated to mark the site where lie the mortal remains of George Wythe, born 1726, died 1806. Jurist and statesman, teacher of Randolph, Jefferson, and Marshall, first professor of law in the United States, and first Virginia signer of the Declaration of Independence. And this marker here was placed in 1922. So I'm not entirely sure the story of his original marker or headstone. It may have been damaged, lost, stolen. I'll have to look into that. But either way, for the past 104 years now, this marker has stood to mark the grave of George Wythe. And as always, I like to find the signer of the Declaration of Independence plaque here. We see George Wythe's. But like for many of the signers, it's a very simple marker. Yeah, nothing on the back. And you can see from this angle how close it is to St. John's Church. But a really nice burial ground. And it's wonderful to visit the final resting place of another signer of the Declaration, George Wythe. It's great to be able to visit one more grave of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and more importantly, to just remember the life of men like George Wythe, and also to visit historic St. John's Church to see where Patrick Henry gave his famous speech. It's just so much history in one small area. And you're talking about in a city like Richmond, which is filled with a ton of history from the colonial days all the way through the American Civil War and to today. So really, really excited to have been able to visit here. And if you ever get a chance, if you're passing through the area at the very least, I definitely recommend making the stop. There's a lot of history to see, but I think even in small trips and small chunks, you can experience a lot of it and, just take in that American history. And sort of as a little postscript here, we're actually over in colonial Williamsburg, and this here is the original home that was owned and lived in by George Wythe in colonial Williamsburg. So a beautiful structure, one of 89 original 18th century structures here in Williamsburg. So thought I'd add that so you all can take a look at it with me.